Hi, I thought I would put together a bit of a video on Camera Raw because a few people have spoken to me recently that shoot in JPEG and wanted to move up to RAW but were unsure how to process an image. Now, to basically explain why you should process an image from a RAW file as opposed to a JPEG ideally, JPEG images are a compressed format which is often referred to as lossy compression. This means that to make the file smaller, certain bits of information are being thrown away from the file. Now, in a lot of cases, this information won't necessarily be missed, but it is being lost nonetheless. The other process that JPEG images off a camera go through is actual image processing on the camera. The camera makes several educated guesses on how to process the contrast, the brightness, the colour, saturation and sharpness, etc. of the final image. So you don't have any of that control at all. With a RAW image, the image that you see in front of us is basically the image that has come directly from the sensor of the camera. There's no sharpening, there's no contrast adjustments or any compression applied to it. The benefit of this is that the image actually contains a massive amount of information compared to the JPEG, and this allows us to make all of our own choices on how we develop them. The downside is that the RAW images are quite a lot bigger than JPEG, so if you do start shooting in RAW, you may find that you need bigger memory cards and also more storage space to save your images. Now, before we move on, I'll just go into a few things within the interface that I tend to make changes to just to set the interface up. This is the Camera Raw 7.3 interface that comes with Photoshop CS6. It's very similar to, I believe, to the interface that comes with Adobe Elements or Adobe Photoshop Elements 11. There may be a few changes in the amount of options that are up here, but some of this will also be able to be transferred over into Lightroom, which uses a slightly different interface but roughly the same tools. Now, we'll just change a few options before we get started. There's an option down here, by default is set to Adobe RGB. If we click on this, we get the workspace or workflow options that pop up. The first box is just called space, but it actually refers to the color space of the image file itself. Now, Adobe RGB has certain advantages over the other options that are in this drop down box. It will allow more colors to be stored and more shades, etc., but for the most part I tend to use sRGB because it's instantly more compatible with computer monitors and other bits of software basically. If you was to open the image from Camera Raw as an Adobe RGB file, you may find that if you save it as a JPEG, excuse me, that colour space will be saved with it, and it won't look quite right when viewed in a browser. The colours will look slightly different. So generally I prefer to work in sRGB. I would do a bit of reading up and make your own decision. I'm not saying that you definitely should go down this route, but that's how I work through it. The next box here is one called depth, and it refers to the bits per pixel or bits per channel within the image, and it's basically the colour depth. 8 bits per channel refers to being able to store 8 bits per pixel of colour information, and this results in a certain maximum amount of colours. I tend to switch it to 16 bits, which heavily increases the amount of colours that you can have within the image, but it also does increase the file size of the image because you're storing a lot more colour information. Now, that's not a necessity, it's something I prefer to do because I prefer to have as much quality in the image as I can. The benefits of using 16-bit colour is if you was to have an image that has a gradient in, say from white to black, if you do certain adjustments within Photoshop, you may find that those gradients no longer become smooth. 16 bits per channel would allow so many more shades to be stored, and so many more gradients in that overall image. So they're just two things I changed, so we'll just OK that. Now the interface may look quite confusing at first, but don't be put off by it. It's really not that hard to use once you get used to it. But first, before we move on to actual processing the images here, we'll go through a few quick fixes that you can do to images that you should probably do just before you start concentrating on processing the image, just to correct a few things. Now, this image, when I took it, I was standing on a platform without a tripod to take a picture of the side of this train before it left from the station. I tried my best to get the image straight, but obviously failed here because this is on a bit of a slant. Now, there's a simple fix for this. There's a tool at the top called straightening, or the straightening tool. If we click on that, all you need to do is essentially draw a line on the image where the straight edge should be, and the software will make adjustments to straighten that out. It can be a vertical line or a horizontal, but you would draw it on the object in the image which you want to appear straight. So if we click and hold the mouse button and drag this line across this line here, if we let go, you'll see what it's doing is rotating, well, it's cropping the image, and if we select back to the zoom tool, you'll see it rotates it straight, and now we have a straight image. That's all you need to do to correct it. It will lose a little bit of information around the edge where it has to crop the image to rotate, but it does all that automatically, and it's usually such a small amount that it's better to do this process than leave it. Moving on to this image here, if I just switch back to full view, within the image, when I took the photo, there was actually dust on the center of my camera, which is an issue that you may run into at some point with your SLR. There's no easy way to avoid it. When you're changing lenses, there's a chance of dust getting in. This can usually be blown off with an air blower. If you refer to your manual, it'll tell you how to do it. The only thing I will mention is don't use compressed air canisters, as they can actually damage the camera. These two spots here then, and there's one over here, are basically silhouettes of dust that are on the sensor. They tend to show up at very high f-stops more than the lower f-stops. In this case, rather unnecessarily, I had taken the picture at f25. This showed them up quite heavily. If I'd taken it at f8, then these may not be visible. To get rid of these, you could do various cloning processes within Photoshop, but there's a tool in Camera Raw that will do this as well. So if you click on spot removal, by default it will actually come up as a cross, which is useless to us. We need to actually increase the radius. What we want to do is increase the radius so that it's bigger than the area that we want to fix. So if we place the mouse over this area here and then we click, you'll see the spot has disappeared. We have had these marks on the image, these two circles. Just to explain those, the red one is the area we're fixing, and the green one is the area of the photo that it's taking the information from to blend into here. If I do the same down here and across here, you'll see that we have those fixed. If you want to see it without these overlays on, there's a little button down here that will turn those off, and you can see now we don't have any black dots. Now, just before I move on to the actual processing of images, the changes that we've made, even the ones we've made so far, cropping the image by rotating it and letting it crop it, and also the spot removal, they're not destructive changes that are happening on the image. Everything that is done to a raw image is actually saved in a sidecar file, which is sort of a settings file for the image. So if you was to delete that settings file, the image would load up as if it had come off the camera again. Just because we're making these changes to the image, don't confuse them with actually being committed to the image. They're very easy to undo, and as they're only stored in a settings file, if you change your mind and want to change those settings, you don't need to recopy an original file back over or anything like that. So I just thought I'd mention that. If we switch to this image, then this is one we're actually going to run through the processing on. Now, the best way to think of raw images is basically as a digital negative. It's very similar to, or rather the analogy I would use is if you was to take a photo with a Polaroid camera, you would get a photo very quickly, but it may not be processed how you want. If you was to take a photo in the past with a film camera, you could spend time in a dark room adjusting and getting the development of that image down to how you want it. Now that's very similar to camera raw. It will take you a bit more time, or raw images rather, it will take you a bit more time in camera raw to get the results that you want, but it's well worth the effort. So if we look at this image, it looks quite good already straight off the camera. I got lucky on that day, there was nice sunshine, so the image has come out quite nice already. But before we move on to changing some of these settings, I'll just explain two other little things that need switching on. Up here on the histogram, you have these two upward facing triangles. If I turn these on, you may notice a few things happen to the image. There's now rather strangely a piece of red that has appeared on the leg of the deer, and if I zoom into this area, I believe we'll have little bits of blue. Now, to explain what these are, the red marks on the image, they're not actually going to be saved on the image, they're just warnings. They're basically a warning that that area of the image with these current settings is so bright that the detail within that area is being lost. So if you imagine there's lots of different shades of cream and light brown, etc., that may be in this area that are currently being made to be white and are blending in. It says small amount on this image, but you may open other images that have a very bright sky and it will give you the same warning over a big area. You'll also see much bigger warnings in a minute when I start messing with these settings down here. Now the blue is exactly the same, but it's basically telling us that these areas are becoming black, whereas they're not. They actually contain they contain various other shades that are close to black but shouldn't be black. So if we zoom out, if we turn these on, as I say, these will come into effect or come into aid us later. Just to mention on how you tell whether it's on or off, it's not particularly clear, but if you look at this here, off there's no grey border around the button, and on there is a grey border, so you'll often see the red and blacks come in, red and blues, sorry, come in on the image anyway. But okay, so if we start with the white balance settings, this is very similar to the white balance on your camera, but this actually allows us to make changes to that white balance. So if for some reason you've been shooting on auto white balance and the camera hasn't produced the colours that you remember seeing, you may find that you can tweak these sliders here to get the result. There's various settings down here, and they're very similar to what you'll find on your SLR, daylight setting, cloudy, etc. Those are presets. They sometimes do the job, sometimes don't. If I recall correctly, if we click auto on this, it will make an adverse effect to the image. You may still decide that you like the image like that, but I actually prefer it as it was shot on the by the camera, so we won't change anything on there. Temperature and tint are two controls for adjusting the white balance. If I move this here, you'll see we'll make the image warmer, and this way we'll make it colder, and it's basically bluer this way and yellow that way. And again, you can see now the clipping warnings are coming into effect. We'll obviously not be making that kind of change to the image at the moment. So if we click as shot, then we'll leave it at that and move on. It's very easy to see this auto button and click it and think, well, that's going to do everything for me, but in some cases it will put you on the right track, in other cases it will just completely ruin the image. If I do it on this image, I believe it makes it extremely dark, drains a bit of life out of the image. Now Camera Raw thinks it knows what it's doing. In some cases it does, in this case it's not. So we'll default them back. Now, exposure and contrast can be talked about together in some ways, because they're both a global effect on the image, and by this I mean if you push the exposure up, the image will get brighter, much in the same way the exposure on a camera works. But if we push it up, we're basically increasing and decreasing the brightness of the entire image. It's not discriminating between any shades or any colours or any brightnesses. It is literally going to make the entire image brighter or the entire image darker. The contrast is exactly the same. If we move the contrast up, we'll increase the contrast in the entire image, and down we'll reduce it in the entire image. Now, there's nothing bad about these controls, but just keep that in mind when you're adjusting them. They will adjust everything in the image. So I think on this case we'll move the exposure up slightly just to brighten the image. We'll probably come back to some of these sliders, as you will often find. You'll set a couple of them and change others, and they'll need a few tweaks. If I push the contrast up a little as well, probably about there will do. There's not much difference, but there's a bit more contrast. Now, moving on to highlights and also whites, I'll deal with these in a pair as well. The highlights are the very bright colours, but not the whites. It's your very bright yellows, bright reds, bright blues, etc. But it's not the very extreme end of the spectrum of the whites. Now, highlights, if we look into this area, this is basically giving us a warning that we're losing a bit of information in here. And what we can do is now reduce this amount of information lost down by moving the highlights. Now, to your eyes and even mine, we're not really losing much in there anyway, but it's worth trying to regain it back. If you do still end up with some red areas on areas like this, it's up to you to decide whether you're happy with that loss, or if it's even noticeable to the eye. In some cases it's not, and it's not worth worrying about, so don't feel you have to definitely get rid of all the images, all the warnings on the image before loading it in. So if I just zoom back out, the whites is basically going to affect all the very, very bright colours, or whites rather. So if we push the white slider up, you'll see the very bright areas in the image are actually being increased in brightness, but you'll notice this back area here, especially this black dark area, is not really being affected by this slider. The leaves and that are, where they have very bright areas on them, but the black area isn't, and this is why these are sort of a localized adjustment. So if we leave this up a little bit, I know for a fact that when we finish we'll probably end up with some of this warning on here. I'm not overly bothered about it, to be honest. The shadows and blacks are very, very similar to highlights and whites, but they work at the complete other end of the spectrum. The shadows will increase the darker end of the spectrum, but again not the blacks. So what we can do here, if we pull it down, you'll see it's given us these warnings we're losing information here. So what we can do is push this up, and as I push this up, if I keep pushing it, you'll see there's actually a lot of data, a lot of image within that area that wasn't visible before. If I click the preview button just to switch between the original image and the one we're looking at, you'll see just how much information is being brought out of the image by making these kind of adjustments. Now, I don't necessarily want to go quite that far. Just put preview back on. It's often a good idea to actually do this adjustment looking at the entire image, just to make sure you're not ruining other areas of the image. But if we move this to about here, then we're getting a bit more detail in there. So now we'll look over to the blacks, and if we increase this up again, you'll see if I push it all the way, we're bringing out all of the detail in here. I kind of like a bit of a dark area there, as long as we don't go too dark, so we'll just set it roughly around there. and now you'll see we've got no clipping warnings, and if we switch between the original image and this image, you'll see I brought out a bit more detail here, and also we've got rid of those warnings. Now moving on to the clarity slider, it's very easy to assume that this is the same as sharpening. It's similar, but it doesn't work in the same way as actual sharpening, but it will increase the clarity of the image. I tend to have my camera raw defaulted at around 30. That just adds a bit more clarity to the image by default. If you push it too far, you'll get a very harsh look, and if you turn it all the way down, you'll get a very sort of soft, dreamy look. So just have a play about with that and decide what you want to set it to. The vibrance slider is just going to adjust the vibrance of the colours within the image. If we push the vibrance slider all the way up, it will oversaturate and make the colours over vibrant, and all the way down it drains most of the colour out of the image. To be honest, I don't really mess with that slider. I tend to leave it as it is. I've never really found I can improve an image by increasing the vibrance. I prefer to work with the saturation instead. I'm not saying don't use it. You can make up your own mind. If you need to move it or want to move it to get the effect that you want, then obviously you can do that. The saturation slider is basically going to adjust the saturation of the colours in the image. We've got quite a lot of colour saturation already, but what we can do, if we push it all the way up, you'll see the effect it has, and if we push it all the way down, we'll see we go to pretty much a black and white image. Don't confuse this with a method to convert the image to black and white. There's no reason why we couldn't open the image now and have a black and white image, but you'll get a much better result by processing in colour in Camera Raw and then working to process it to black and white in Photoshop or Photoshop Elements. It gives you a lot more control that way, and you'll get a lot better image. So if we just move this slider up, we'll raise the contrast, the saturation a little bit, and you'll see a few of these areas have come out with new warnings, because when we increase the saturation, it will brighten some of those areas. We can try and drop the highlights, the clipping down a little bit by using the highlight slider, but in this case we're still going to end up with a few spots here or there. As I say, I don't believe that in my opinion, that you need to get rid of all of them, but if you have, for example, a red car and you have it overly saturated or the contrast very high, you could lose almost all the detail and imperfections in the paint of the car, and it will look a bit strange and a bit false. So it's worth paying attention to these clipping warnings and correcting them, and even in some cases you can use the highlight slider to regain a lot of information in a very bright sky. So when you originally open the image, the sky is almost pure white. You can use the highlight slider to bring out the cloud and the texture in the sky. So they're very good tools to use, highlights, and also the shadows, which work at the other end of the spectrum. Now we've got the image looking pretty much how I want it before I load it into Photoshop. The only thing I would mention is don't necessarily concentrate on getting the image perfect in Camera Raw. There's other adjustments such as curves and levels in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements, which will allow you to adjust things further, but we want to get things as close as we can in Camera Raw, and then maybe do the rest of it within our image editor. Now, just to finish off, I'll explain a few of the buttons at the bottom and just what they do. I believe you can move the mouse over them to get a message of what they actually do, but I'll just explain it. Open image will open the image in your image editor, and it will also save all of these changes, any other changes you've made, to the sidecar file for future reference. The cancel button will literally cancel everything and quit out, and the done button will apply the changes and save them to a file. to the sidecar file, but it won't open the image in your image editor. Now, another feature that's worth knowing about, and you can also use this in Photoshop requester boxes as well, if you hold down the left Alt key, you'll notice that these buttons all, well, two of them change. If I just sit here and toggle it, you'll see I'm just pressing the Alt key and it's changing these. If I hold it down and you click this open copy button whilst the Alt key is held down, it will basically open the image but without saving any of the changes. This might be useful if you've made changes to the image and you want to open them but you don't want to affect your original settings. If we keep the Alt key held down and click the cancel button, it actually is a reset button and it will reset all of these settings to the default. And so that's basically it. It's hopefully that's proved useful to some of you, and if there's any questions, if you let me know on Facebook, just leave me a message or a comment, and as I say, I hope it's been useful to you. I wouldn't say that the settings that I necessarily use you need to strictly follow. This is merely my way of working through the processing of my image, so I have a bit of an experiment, but hopefully that's given you an idea of what the various adjustments that you make in Camera Raw are, and it'll get you pointed in the right direction for getting used to raw images. So as I say, hopefully this has been interesting to you, and I may produce another one in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye.